Now, if you're going to be working in any type of Microsoft administration services these days, there are some fundamental principles that are very important that you understand. So what I want to do is I want to get into some of the foundations of understanding things like Microsoft domains, understanding some of the networking technologies, RAS and VPNs and virtualization, and also we're going to talk about the cloud services and how all that fits into this. But it's important to kind of start from the beginning so you can understand where things have been, understand where things are going, and you have to consider the fact that the world is transitioning now more into a cloud-oriented environment, but in the past everything was managed on-prem or on-premise, and we got to talk about this transition and how things were and how things are now and where Microsoft is going. So to start with, we go back in time to the 1950s, 1960s. They had mainframes, these gigantic computers that would take up like entire rooms. They used vacuum tubes. And then as we moved into the 1970s, something miraculous happened. They created what was known as an IC, an integrated circuit, which allowed basically binary math to be processed through little chips. And this is where personal computing became popular. So in the 1980s, personal computers started coming out. I'm going to draw this little symbol here to represent a computer. And I tell you what, I'm going to create another little symbol here to kind of represent a bunch of computers. So in the 1980s, companies started buying PCs and personal computers, and they started showing up in people's offices, and eventually, they were networking them together and all of that. And so this is where things really get started. Now, of course, in those days, one of the problems was we lived in what was called a peer-to-peer network. So what would happen is these computers you could network these computers together with various technologies, but there was no centralization, meaning each computer was equal. There was no computer that controls all the other computers. A network admin would have to, if they wanted to make changes, they'd have to sit down at each and every computer to make those changes or get users to help them, which was always a nightmare. And so that didn't, it worked, but it didn't work very efficiently, all right? Now, as we moved into the 1990s, there was a company that was gaining ground called Novell, and they had a product called NetWare, which was the idea of that was to use a server that would help manage machines and also allow people to share files easier, whereas in a peer-to-peer network back originally, these machines would have to share files with each other and people would have to know each other's passwords. It just didn't work very well. Well, eventually with the creation of the file server concept, you had a more powerful machine that you could share files on and all that, and eventually Novell even came out with the idea of a server that could manage other machines. Now this is kind of where Microsoft comes in. Microsoft created their product called NT, and they created this concept of a domain controller, which is a special type of server that can manage these other servers. Now, fast forward, they came out with what was known as a domain, but fast forward to the year 2000, Microsoft releases their newest domain technology, and they call it Active Directory. And Active Directory domains were represented by a triangle. All right, and a domain controller was a server essentially that had a database on it, and that database was the Active Directory database. So let's just kind of fix that here. This little cylinder looking thing I'm going to make here is going to represent my Active Directory database. So AD. All right, and this is what we still call to this day. We call it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And usually if you hear that term, Active Directory Domain Services, it means it's an on-premise domain. Although there is a version of this that can be hosted in the cloud known as Azure Active Directory Domain Services. I'm not getting into that right now. So anyway, you would always want to have more than one domain controller. The reason you want to have more than one domain controller is because the same reason you have more than one of any type of server, really. One reason being to break up the disbursement of load, these machines will authenticate with these domain controllers, and the more machines you got, you don't want all of that just going to one domain controller, right? The other consideration is redundancy. If you only have one and that server goes down, well, you're in trouble, right? So we want to have multiple. The other thing about domain controllers that are interesting is that they replicate. So, for example, I'm going to make a little smiley face guy here, and this little smiley face guy is going to represent my user. So we create a user account on a domain controller. Now, the interesting thing about user accounts, or the interesting thing really about domain controllers, is that they replicate. So everything you do on one will replicate over to the other. So if I create a user account on that first one, well, replication is going to occur between both of them. And so this little arrow thing I'm going to make here is going to represent replication. So domain controllers replicate. That means that this user could log on to any one of these thousands of machines, and it's going to authenticate with the domain controller. All right. The authentication protocol that is used is the protocol known as Kerberos. All right. Kerberos is the authentication protocol. What is a protocol? It's like a language, basically. Okay. Now there was an older protocol that it also supported called NTLM. That was for legacy, for older prior to the year 2000 machines. Now that protocol allowed us to have encrypted passwords and all that, and authenticate securely and all that fun stuff. The other thing is Active Directory uses a language known as the Directory Service Language, and that language was called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now all that is, again, this is all decades old at this point. At the time when it came out, it was cutting edge, but it is a bit dated nowadays. But it still works, and it's still pretty secure, though there are some considerations on security that I'm not going to explain right now. Now, the other thing that's important about Active Directory is that all machines have to have a name. And the name must be, of course, associated with an IP address and all of that. And so there is a service that we use it on the internet all the time, called DNS, Domain Name Service. Our domain must have a name. Usually when you name your domain, you would name it after your company, and a lot of people even name their domains based on their web presence. So for example, my domain might be called examlabpractice.com. That's my company, my web presence. And I'm going to need to have a server in my domain that can associate the names and IP addresses together. So that server is called a DNS server. DNS, Domain Name System Server. And that server will also have to have a little database on it, and that database will be our DNS database. Okay. So we'll just draw another little cylinder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, border it with red, and then I'm going to color code the database red, which means that this database, the DNS database, is associated with that name. Now what happens is our machines, clients, domain controllers, we also might even have, let's draw a file server over here. Pretty common that we have file servers in our environment. Okay. All of these machines would register with our DNS. All right. And this allows for the centralization of name resolution, meaning they register their IP addresses into this database, and then now anytime a machine needs to find another machine, it can query DNS. So for example, these machines all have to authenticate by your domain controllers. They can query DNS and say, hey, DNS, do you know what the address is of one of my domain controllers so I can authenticate? And DNS can reply back and say, yeah, here is the information. At that point, the client can go and authenticate. So it works very efficiently. Now, all of this together, this idea of domain controllers, this triangle you see here, this provides centralization. So we moved away from peer-to-peer networking back in the day where every machine was kind of its own boss and there was no centralized way of managing things, to now we are working in a centralized environment. These domain controllers help us centralize. This DNS service helps us centralize. So we now have some central control over things. One of the great things about our domain controllers too is we have these wonderful things called GPOs, group policy objects. A group policy object is this object that you can create that has all these settings, parameters, any type of attribute you want to configure or change on machines, you can do it through a GPO. So for example, if your boss walks up to you and says, hey, I want you to force the firewalls to be turned on all these machines. I want to make sure that the antivirus is always up to date. I want you to disable some of the wallpaper feature. I don't want people putting crazy wallpapers on their machine. So I mean, the sky's the limit. There are literally thousands of things you can do inside of a GPO. But what happens is that GPO can instruct these machines to turn things on and turn things off. GPOs also replicate. So when you create a GPO on a domain controller, it replicates over to the other domain controller. So it doesn't matter which machines authenticate with which domain controller. All right. So these GPOs can be deployed out to these machines, and this is how you turn things on, turn things off. You could even deploy software with that if you wanted to. So it was very, very powerful, a very, very powerful system for managing everything. All right. Of course, let's throw the internet into the mix here. Let's say that this little cloud is going to represent the internet, and let's talk about a little bit about how that sort of fits into the picture. Let me just clean it up here with the mighty stroke of my paintbrush. I will clean up the internet. All right. All right, so then we have the internet, right? So maybe we've got an internet connection that's coming in here. All right, and of course you don't want to just leave your internal network exposed, so your company would generally have a firewall, right? And we'll just put that firewall right here. And so now we have a secure way for traffic to flow out to the internet, and the only things that can come in would be things that we send out, and we could allow things through that firewall if we want to. Now, this is a traditional domain. This is the way we've done things for 20 years, all right? And in this next little section, I want to talk about expansion on all of this and where things have gone with things like RAS and all that, and VPN and virtualization. So that'll wrap this little section up, and we'll move on to the next. I now want to talk about some concepts that are also sort of the foundation of how we've done things over the years. It's important to understand how we've done things over the years so we can understand how things are now. So looking back, we have an Active Directory domain, ADDS as it's called, Active Directory Domain Services, which uses the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which uses Kerberos for authentication, or for the legacy back in the 90s devices that used NTLM, a New Technology LAN Manager, which isn't all very new these days, but even Kerberos is pretty old considering we've been using it for decades, and I think actually the protocol even came out back in the 1980s. So we got some data technologies, but the technologies have been updated, a lot of them over the years, to be secure, so you can still feel comfortable using those. But let's talk about some different scenarios now. The first thing I want to look at is the scenario of what happens when we have a user who is not at the office. So this person is working from home. Working from home is a lot more popular nowadays than it has been in the past, so it's very common. And this person needs the ability perhaps to be able to connect in and access services that are inside. Okay, and we've got a file server, but ultimately you probably are aware that in the past it was always this mindset of do it yourself, host your own server. So your companies might have a file server, but then they might also have a they might have a SQL database server that users need to access. Let's create that SQL. All right. Maybe Microsoft Exchange. That was email, right? Microsoft Exchange was used for email, and then maybe even like SharePoint was very popular. by Microsoft on premise. So here you've got these, these 4 servers providing a service to our devices, and you've got users working from home and everything else needing to get access to those. Let me just kind of move those a little bit over here, make a little bit of room here, and I'm going to shrink those down just a little bit as well. All right. So this user who is working from home needs to access these services, but the person is not, not around. Well, let me tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't just open up all the ports on the firewall and allow this person in to get access to these devices unsecurely. In fact, in the 90s, a lot of companies did that. The very first company I ever worked for, back in the 90s, they didn't really have a firewall, so you literally could share out you had a public address, and you could connect to it from home. It was really scary when I think about it. Even in the 90s, that was scary, but nowadays it's incredibly scary. Why is it scary? Because you got these people out there that want to do things that they shouldn't do, and get access to companies' data and try to do damage and ransom and all of that, ransomware and all that. And who are these people? Well, we generally call them hackers, right? So let me draw a little hacker. This little box here is going to represent my hacker. All right, and let's make this hacker look like he's up to no good. All right, I'm gonna give him let's give him like a devil horns, some devil horns here, and maybe he's in a bad mood. I'm gonna give him a frowny face, and give him some fangs, and maybe the fangs are dripping blood okay, no, I'm just kidding. Sorry, sometimes I get carried away. All right, but anyway, that's going to be my hacker. All right, goofy looking little hacker person. All right, and so we don't want this hacker spying on my user. We don't want this hacker getting access to resources inside. So how do we get around that? Well, usually the way we would do that is you would use a VPN, a virtual private network. So the way you would do that is you could purchase what was called a VPN concentrator, and basically it's a device that allows secure connections in. But in the Microsoft world, we actually had a type of server we could set up called a RAS server, or also known as an RAS server because it stood for Routing and Remote Access Services. But anyway, remote access services is the idea here, and with that we have support for VPN. Now what does that do? This allows this thing called a VPN tunnel to be created, which means that you have this encrypted communications that goes through to that RAS server, and then from there that RAS server allows you to access other resources securely. This hacker will not be able to see the traffic that's flowing through because it's all encrypted. The only thing the hacker would be able to see is that it was going up to this firewall, and that would be it. Wouldn't be able to see what the traffic said. So this is how we would definitely help secure things. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you about here is what happens when a company needs to have a service that is exposed to the internet. For example, let's say that your company is going to host their own web server, okay? So you set up a web server. All right, maybe this is going to be www.examlabpractice.com or whatever, and people from the internet need to be able to get to it anonymously. Well, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to put that web server? Are you going to put it internally inside the domain like you see here? And the reason that's scary is because you would have to open up port 443, port 80, which is the HTTP ports, to allow traffic to get in, which means not only could somebody out there on the internet anonymously get into this web server, but technically so could a hacker. And if a hacker was ever to gain access over this website by hacking it, then something called pivoting could occur, where a hacker could actually gain access to these other services that are on your network. And so that's where things are really scary. So you definitely won't want to host it internally most of the time, although there was a way to do something called a reverse proxy. I won't get into that right now. But we would probably want to put this outside, right? So we want to put it out here. But there's something else that's a problem on that. If you put it outside that firewall, you don't have to worry about people getting allowing traffic to come in. But the scary thing about that is the fact that this poor web server is now completely exposed to the internet, so with no protection. So the way around that usually is people would get another firewall. So you'd have two firewalls. This first firewall would be called the internal connected firewall, and then this firewall here would be called the external connected firewall. Now this little network between that, we would call that a DMZ, demilitarized zone, or now the more popular term is perimeter network. Okay, so DMZ, perimeter network are basically the same thing. All right, and so now what you would do is you would only open the ports like port 80, 443, 53 for DNS if you put DNS in there, whatever ports there that you need, and now traffic would be able to get to this web server. Okay, and so even if a hacker somehow hacks this web server, you're not going to allow traffic to pass through this firewall and get to these resources. The only traffic that you might allow would be VPN. Okay, and there's a bunch of authentication and all that has to happen to make that work. All right, so that's the idea of remote access and VPNs in a nutshell for you, as well as the concept of DMZ and the perimeter network idea. Now, the final thing I want to look at with you in this video is the idea of virtualization. So I talked about how in the past it was always the mindset was we got to host everything ourselves. We got to have our own little data center. We got to have our we got to have our own servers, file server, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, all that, and it's all got to be hosted by us. And that's the way things have always been done. All right. Now, then what you'll find is as time went on, a company called VMware came out with a way of expanding on virtualization. Just so you know, virtualization is not a new term. Virtualization has been around for a very long time. In fact, the term hypervisor is essentially the software that lets us emulate hardware. And if you can emulate hardware, you can also store software on that emulated hardware. That's the idea of virtualization. That term hypervisor has been around since the 1970s. The idea of even mainframes dividing up processing time and doing shared computing was a form of virtualization. So this is not a new concept, but VMware, they expanded on this idea, and the thing that they did that really pushed the envelope on all this was that, hey, you don't necessarily need 4 different servers. And here's the other thing. Here's the other crazy thing. If you wanted redundancy for those 4 servers, you'd really need 8 servers, right? You could do clustering those together. So you'd have 8 servers to provide redundancy for those. But with virtualization, I can set up a hypervisor server, 1 server, and virtualize those other servers. Now, in the Microsoft world, we call that Hyper-V. That is the software that does this, Hyper-V, hypervisor. Microsoft's not the one that came up with that. VMware is not the first to ever come up with that. VMware was the biggest contributor to this concept, though, so I do have to give them credit where credit is due. All right, now the other beautiful thing, though, about this is you get a really, really powerful machine. You virtualize your machines on those. You get these things called checkpoints in Microsoft. They used to be called snapshots, and a lot of other companies still call them snapshots, where you can make changes without the worry of breaking anything because you can revert back to before the change was made. The other thing that's wonderful about using virtualization is if I want to have complete redundancy, I don't have to have 8 servers. I could literally, purchase another server and have a copy of the virtual machines on that other server. Now I've only got 2 servers as opposed to having to have a total of 8 servers. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature capability that kind of started everything. Another thing that we got, and this is kind of where you start thinking about cloud computing, is with virtualization comes the term elasticity, which basically means that each of these machines can be given a certain amount of RAM processing power, but here's what's interesting about that. If one of the servers isn't using all of the available RAM that it's been given, it can share it with other servers. So for example, this file server has been given more RAM than it needs, and then SQL needs that RAM. The file server can give up some of that RAM over to SQL, and when SQL's done using that extra memory, it can release it back to everybody it's basically a pool type scenario where it gets released into a pool of RAM and pool of CPU, and they can grow and shrink as they need. And that's the small way of sort of on-premise way of looking at elasticity. Of course, when you get into cloud computing, you'll learn that that can expand across multiple machines across the board in these big data centers, but not to get into that just yet here. But that's the idea. Hopefully that now helps you with understanding that concept of what virtualization is. And with that is really where, cloud computing started to come into play, which I'm not explaining in this video. But hopefully now you have a much better understanding of the concept of the RAS, VPN, as well the DMZ concepts and virtualization. And now in this next section, we'll start getting into the concept of cloud services. Now, with the creation of virtualization, this got companies thinking, if we can emulate hardware, we can create these virtual machines, and we can store software on there. We can have operating systems running on that emulated hardware, the operating systems being called guest operating systems. We could technically host these virtual machines for companies for a price as a service. So the idea being, hey, you pay us a fee each month and we'll host your virtual servers, and you don't have to deal with all the headaches of hosting your own data center on premise, and the power that's needed to do that, and the air conditioning that's needed to do that, all the hardware that's needed to do that, as well as the knowledge of how all the hardware works. So this is essentially what a cloud company brings to the table. So various companies like Google and IBM and Microsoft and Apple and all these companies, a lot of them already had tons of data centers, these big massive warehouses all over the world that they could support it. Some of these companies, such as Microsoft and IBM and Amazon, and Amazon being one of the biggest and first, decided to open this up to the public for a fee and allow you to host your services in their data centers. So this is where cloud computing really comes into place. So this big cloud here is going to represent cloud computing, mainly the Microsoft cloud computing. And of course, it's all connected to the internet with incredibly fast, high-speed internet connections, fiber connections, and all of that. So there's some terminology or some acronyms I want to talk a little bit about real fast here as we get into this. First off, in cloud computing, there is an acronym we call IaaS. That stands for Infrastructure as a Service. Okay? Infrastructure as a service means that a provider is hosting all of the hardware infrastructure for you, and then they are going to provide you with a way for you to interact with that hardware and utilize their hardware as a service. All right, and this, of course, is where Azure comes into play, Microsoft Azure. Now, you might pronounce that word different. People have different ways of saying Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it, I've even heard it called Azure before, Azure. There's various names for it. In fact, years ago when I was first learning Azure, I decided I wanted to make sure I was pronouncing this correctly. So I was like, I'm going to go to watch the developers. So I started watching videos of the developers, the people who created Azure, and I figured I would determine. The very first video I ever watched, the guy was pronouncing the word Azure, so that's how I say it. But what I further learned is that the Microsoft developers don't agree on how to say it either. Some of them say Azure, some of them call it Azure, some of them call it Azure. So anyway, tomato, tomato, pronounce it however you want to pronounce it, okay? But Azure is Microsoft's main IaaS system. What this is Microsoft is going to host, they've got all these data centers all over the world, and they're going to host their hardware so that you can host on top of their hardware your virtual machines or whatever it is. So you can host virtual machines. Microsoft will also allow you to have access to what are called virtual appliances, like virtual firewalls, also virtual load balancing software, because you can get access to what are called VNets, This is virtual networking, so you can create these virtual networks based on TCP/IP that are running your, in their cloud service with virtual machines on it, and then you can put a virtual firewall. So you can almost like recreate what you're seeing here in an on-premise environment. You can recreate that in the cloud. They also provide virtual storage, so you can store data and backup data out there. They support database hosting, all of that. That's all part of IaaS. Now with IaaS, the model for that, for the most part, is you pay for what you use. So there's an algorithm that looks at how much memory, how much processing power, how much storage that's being used, and then you get a fee each month for what you're using. The good news is they do have a calculator that kind of helps you forecast this. And you can even set alarms to let you know if you're approaching a certain budget that you've got on cost. There's a lot of things out there to help you do that. But that's the idea. You pay for what you use. Okay, now there is another couple of terms I want to mention as well. This next term is called Platform as a Service, and then there's a third term called Software as a Service. So Platform as a Service, PaaS, and Software as a Service. Platform as a Service and software. Let me explain software as a service first, because it's pretty easy to visualize, and then I'll explain platform as a service. So the idea of software as a service is basically they have applications that can be hosted in the cloud service, apps, if you will. These apps are 100% ready to use, ready for you to take advantage of. All you got to do is use those applications. Okay. For example, Microsoft has what's called Office for the web, or it used to be called Office Online. So that's like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You can run it from within your web browser. All you got to do is just jump right in and use it. So from an admin standpoint, all we have to do is assign the users that are allowed to use that, and they can go use it, and it's available to them 100%. All they got to do is start using it. There's not really a lot of administration for us. Now, what is Platform as a Service? Well, Platform as a Service is a system in which the majority of the configuration is done for us, but we still have some admin configuration we have to do to use it. For example, with virtual machines, this is 100% IaaS. A virtual machine you can put whatever operating system on there, but you're responsible for the operating system. You're responsible for the software that goes on it. You as an admin have to manage all that. Okay. With Platform as a Service, virtual machines are set up in the background that you don't have any control over. They've already put the operating system on there. They've already put the software on there. You don't have any control over any of that. But there's still some administration you have to do in order to control it. For example, Microsoft has a directory service called Azure AD. Now, this is a big deal. This is probably one of the biggest deals of the things I've gone over so far in this cloud. Azure Active Directory is what we call a platform as a service. It is a directory service that is sort of the cloud version of what you have here called ADDS. So now I remember when I first heard about Azure Active Directory, I thought, oh, well, this is just like you're just hosting virtual domain controllers in the cloud. No, they have completely redone the concepts of Active Directory. It is completely redone with all new web-based programming languages. It does not use any of the dated stuff like LDAP and Kerberos and all that. It uses industry standard authentication protocols in order to support all the latest and greatest features and capabilities in the cloud. Okay, and so these are where users, passwords, all of that stuff is going to be managed in the cloud. But it starts out with almost nothing in it. So it's ready to use, but you as an admin have to start creating users and all of that. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what if I want to use my on-premise users in the cloud? Well, stand by, I'll explain that in a second. Anyway, Azure AD is a platform as a service. So is, here's another one, Exchange Online. Microsoft has Exchange Online. That is actually both a platform as a service and a software as a service, in that the admin side of it is the platform as a service, but the user side is the software as a service. Same thing for SharePoint Online. Microsoft has SharePoint Online as well. Same idea there. All right. And then you've got Microsoft Teams. That's the admin side of that is a platform as a service, but the user side of that is a software as a service. There is OneDrive for Business. That's a cloud storage that we have access to that allows users to store their data out there in the cloud. There is a product called Intune, which is Microsoft's MDM product. MDM, it's also MAM product, so it's both. Mobile device management, that allows us to manage devices. This is one of the most powerful things we have available to us. This is what sort of is replacing the concept of GPOs. This is going to allow us to manage our device settings. Not only can we manage on-premise devices, but we can manage mobile devices. GPOs can only manage devices for Windows. With Intune, we can manage Windows, Android, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, all that stuff. With the help of Intune, we can manage the settings and restrictions. We can deploy software. This is a very, very powerful product, okay, that we have available to us. It even has a thing called Autopilot, which will allow us to reconfigure Windows machines and all of that. So very, very powerful stuff that we have available to us. All right. Now, I will tell you that Azure has, Azure definitely has some of the, it has some platform as a service technologies and some software as a services technologies, but the main type of system that Microsoft has created for platform as a service and software as a service is called Microsoft 365. Okay, Microsoft 365. All right, which I forgot to add to my display here. We actually do have apps that are called the Microsoft 365 apps. All right, which formerly they would call them Office 365 apps. They're now, starting to call them Microsoft 365 apps. But the Microsoft 365 services it is a cloud service that basically sits on top of Azure. So you have Azure in the background of all this, and the Microsoft 365 sitting on top of it. All right, you can't have a Microsoft 365 account or tenant that doesn't also have Azure. Azure is in the background no matter what. And the other thing to be aware of is both of these share Azure AD. So you'll notice that there are web portals for creating users and things through Microsoft 365 or creating users through Azure. It all ties back to Azure AD. You're going to see the same users no matter what. So these two things are glued together basically. Okay, they're glued together. Now on Microsoft 365 with PaaS and SaaS and all that, you're not really going to be hosting virtual machines, but you're going to be working with these services. Let's just kind of color code some of this real quick. All right. Now again, I do want to add that Azure does have PaaS and SaaS services that I'm not getting into right now, but it's mainly an IaaS based service. That's its main focus. Microsoft 365 is strictly PaaS related and software as a service, SaaS related. It doesn't really have any virtual machines or any of that, though it can interact with them. Okay, so if I was to sort of draw a circle around some of these, all of this stuff you see here would be Azure related, and then all of this stuff you see right here would be the Microsoft 365 related. Now, they both share Azure AD, so I'm going to put a purple circle around that. Red and blue make purple. All right, and so they all link to that. Okay, and so that is how Microsoft handles those concepts. The other thing about Azure is with Azure, you're paying for the CPU, RAM, storage you use. With Microsoft 365, it's all based on licenses. So you purchase these subscriptions that have a certain amount of licenses, and you issue these licenses out to your users, and your users can take advantage of these various features. Okay. One more thing I want to explain here, and that is, what about the issue of what if we want to use our on-premise users to access resources in Azure? Well, Microsoft has a solution for that. They actually have a type of server that you can set up, and the server is called an Azure AD Connect server. Azure AD Connect. Now, what does this do? An Azure AD Connect server, this is a synchronization-based system, and what it will do is it will allow my on-premise users to be synchronized out to Azure AD. Now, it does not allow Azure AD users to be synced in, only out. But it will allow user passwords and all of that to be synced in. So if a user is logging on to Azure AD and they change their password out in the cloud, it does have the ability to synchronize that password back in. But the beauty of this is by going this route, if you have this on-premise environment, you can achieve what we call SSO. What is SSO? Single sign-on. The idea of single sign-on with all of this is my user can sit down at their on-premise computer, they can log on, and it's going to log them on both in the cloud as well, it's going to log them on-premise as well as in the cloud at the same time. All right, and they can access resources out there. The other thing I'll tell you is that Microsoft has moved into a way to where you could technically not even have a domain nowadays. You don't necessarily have to have a domain. In fact, it pains me to say this as a consultant because, I have fed my family for, 2 decades by using Active Directory, both teaching it as well as, consulting on it. But I'll be honest, Microsoft is now moving in a direction to where domains are not even needed anymore. They're now making it possible to where everything can be managed through your cloud service and domains are not needed. But if you're a company that's already got a domain and all this is still in place and all of that, then this Azure AD Connect server is going to be the thing that's going to help you. Okay? All right. Well, hopefully this has now helped you have a better understanding. This was really just a fundamentals video to help you understand the cloud service, the concepts of it, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. Now, as we get into dealing with backup issues in Azure, I'm going to do a little setup here so we have some stuff to play around with. First thing I'm going to do is go to the menu button here, and I'm going to go to storage accounts, and I'm going to create a new storage account. Alright, so just going to click on this, and then from there I'm going to create a resource group. I'm just going to call this storage account RG for resource group. I'm going to create a new storage account called my storage account ELP for exam lab practice, and East US is going to be my region. And I'm just going to go with, I'm not going to go with any redundancy. You should already be aware of how to create storage accounts, so I'm just moving through this relatively quickly here. Nothing else here. I don't think there's anything else I want to enable here. So we're just going to leave all this alone. All right. Yep, everything's good there, and we're just going to click to review. And once this validation is done, we're going to click to create. All right, so I'm going to let my storage account officially get created here. Alright, and I'm also going to create a recovery services vault. So I'm going to go here to the menu button, and I'm going to go to all services, and I'm just going to do a search for the word recovery, and there's recovery services vault. I'm going to create a recovery services vault. Alright, and we'll just store it in the storage account RG. I'm going to call this my recovery vault. Alright, East US, review and create, and we're going to click to create the recovery vault. Our storage account should be done getting created, so I'm going to go over to the menu button now and go back over to storage accounts. There is my storage account right there. I'm going to click on that, and I'm just going to create a file share, and I'm just going to call it images. and we'll click to create that little file share. All right, and I'm going to go to images, and I'm just going to upload a drawing. All right, so let me upload. I'm just going to upload my little domain drawing. All right, the upload is done, so we've got some information set up there. All right, and now I'm going to go back over to my resource groups, click the menu button, go to resource groups, click on storage account, and I'm going to go to my recovery vault here. All right, and as you can see, I have a blade called backup, and I'm going to choose where is your workload. I'm going to say it's running in Azure, and it's going to be Azure file share. And we're going to go ahead and schedule a backup. So I'm going to call this, I'm going to select my storage account, and we're basically going to be able to back up our image. Okay, the storage account was just created, so it is taking just a moment to, let's refresh our web browser. Sometimes if you move a little bit too quick, it doesn't detect it. There it is. Okay. So it's now detected that there is an image there. Okay, I'm going to click OK. I'm going to disable the lock on it, and it's now registering this storage account to the recovery vault so that we can perform backups. So I'm going to let that run through real quick. All right, once that's done, we're just going to click on Add Share, and we're going to click the image here. Images, share that we want to back up. We're going to click OK, and I'm just going to leave the backup policy to the default, and then at the bottom I'm just going to be clicking the Enable Backup button. So we're going to let that run through, and I am going to just go ahead and let that process. I'll pause the recording while that's processing. Now that that's done, I'm going to click on Go to the Resource, and we're going to go down here to Backup Items, and you can see that the Azure File Backup have one item in there. I'm going to click that, and we're going to go right over here to this ellipse symbol, and I'm going to say Backup Now. So this is just going to force this to just go ahead and back up. We're not going to wait on the schedule to trigger this. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and let that run. All right, now that that's done, and I did click refresh just to verify that it was done, and I gave it about 5 minutes, even though it finished backing up very, very quickly. But the reason I gave it a little time is because we want to give it some time to generate the log data that we want to look at, and ultimately that's where we want to go with this. So I want to show you the Backup Center. And the Backup Center is something that hasn't been around since the beginning of Azure. It was added not too long ago so that we can go in and have like a one-stop shop for all your backup needs, if you will, or in other words, just a central place where backups can be handled. So here we are. We're still on portal.azure.com. We're going to click the menu button. We're just going to go down here to All Services, and we're going to do a search for the word backup, and there is the Backup Center. If you want to add that as a favorite, you can, but I'm going to click on the Backup Center, and then first thing I want to show you is the Backup Jobs blade. So if I click on that, Backup Jobs, you'll see we have nothing. And the reason we have nothing is because it's looking at the data source type here called Azure Virtual Machines. So what we want to do is switch that to what we're actually interested in, which in this case is going to be shares, right? Because that's what we've backed up. So we're going to go to Azure File, which is basically Azure File Shares. We're going to click on that, and right out of the gates here, you can see that we have information. So we can see the backup instance, which was images, the subscription, the data source, or data resource, which was the storage account, RG, resource group, and then if we look at the location, East US, the operation, this was an on-demand backup. So first thing you want to know about interpreting backups is that to interpret backups, we need to look at like what operation was performed. This was an on-demand backup. In other words, I triggered it. It was not a scheduled backup. It was an on-demand backup. Of course, if it was scheduled, you would see an indication of that, right? Status was complete. Okay, you got the vault that was associated with the backup, and then the date and time. Okay, and you can see too when it comes to date and time that the start time is going to be it's going to be sorted by the latest entries to the earliest entries, but you can always flip that if you want. You have the ability to sort, so I could say show me the information in which it happened and what order it happened. All right. The other thing I can do up here is I can alter the filters, right? So you already know I can alter the data source. I could look at a different subscription, the vault that I want to look at, the date time range I want to look at. All that can be adjusted. Status of the backup, right? Whether it's in progress, whether it's completed, failed, or completed with warnings, all that would show up right here. All right. I can also come over here to backup reports. All right, and you can see here for backup reports that I've got my subscription selected. There's no workspaces. So when it comes to backup reports, they're wanting you to associate this with a log analytics workspace, which I'm not doing right now. But that's why there's no reporting data here, because you can take the backup job data and it can be converted over into backup reports, which could go into log analytics and all of that. But again, not getting into that in this particular video. All right. The other thing to show you here, when it comes to your backup jobs, is that this log itself does not just update in real time. You do have to refresh if anything's changed. If if backups were occurring right now throughout the day, you would need to refresh in order to see what is showing there. Now the other thing you can do is click select columns, and if there's any specific columns you don't want to look at right now, you can turn those off. Okay, so I could take away the vault information if I wanted to take that column out, or if somebody had already taken some columns out, you can always add those back. All right. But all in all, I hope you'll notice it's actually very easy to look at the reporting data on a backup. You do have to give it some time to get there, to get added in here, but once backups have occurred, you can very easily come in here and take a look at the logging data that's available. Alright, in this video we're going to get into dealing with virtual machine backup issues. So I'm going to start by creating a VM. You should already know how to do this, but I am going to walk through doing it here. So I'm going to go to portal.azure.com, going to click the menu button, and we're going to go down to virtual machines, click to create Azure Virtual Machine. Alright, and we're just going to store this in the storage account RG, and I'm just going to call this WinServer1, and not going to go with any kind of redundancy here, kind of save Azure credit, and I am just going to go with a Server 2022 data center server. Let's go here. We're just going to do that one. Alright, and we can just leave all this as the default. And my admin account is going to be ELP admin for exam lab practice admin. Just going to give it a password. All right. Okay, I'm going to click next. I'm just going to go with standard hard disk drives, save Azure credit. Not going to change any networking related stuff right now. Not going to change any of this. And monitoring. Oh, you know what? I am going to turn auto shutdown on. Okay, I like to do that just in case I forget to turn this off. And usually what I do when I'm done working my resources, I just delete them so it doesn't use a lot of Azure credit. But I also, sometimes if I leave my virtual machines around for a while, I will do an auto shutdown at like 7 p.m. just to be safe. All right, that way it's not just wasting Azure credit. Click next, and I'm going to disable the diagnostics right now. All right. And anything else here? Nothing else, I don't believe. Yep, we're just going to click review and create. And we are going to pull the trigger and let that get created. Alright, so that'll take a moment. Now I've already got, if I go over to my resource groups here, let's let that get submitted here. There we go. I've already got if I right click and go home, just open up a new tab while that's running, I've already got my storage account, which is in the storage account RG here, and I've got a recovery services vault that's already been created. So that's all set up, and now we're just waiting on this server to get complete. Alright, so as you can see, and I did give this just a couple minutes to finish. I had paused the recording while that was going on, but you can see that it's done. I can click go to resource, and the Windows server is up and running. Alright, it has its hard disk drives and all that stuff running, and so everything is good there. If I click on backup, you can see that I do have the option to go ahead and tell it to back up. So as you can see here, if I want to say I want to do a standard backup, you know, my recovery vault, it detected that I had a recovery vault already set up, and I can do the once a day, or I can do the enhanced. All right, and I can go ahead and say let's just enable backup. Now that's one way I could have done that, right? Just triggered the backup that way, which is fine. Another option, let me jump over to another tab here. Another option would have been to go into my recovery vault. So if I click the menu and go into storage account RG, and then go right here to my recovery vault, click backup, I could select Azure Virtual Machine, click backup, and it would detect, say, okay, I want to do an Azure backup, and I could have triggered it this way, right? So I could add the virtual machine that I want to back up, which is WinServer1, and triggered it that way. Could have also altered the backup policy. But as you can see, it is configuring that backup right now. So I will just pause the recording while that's happening. Okay, the backup is complete, or the backup configuration is complete. I'm going to click on Go to Resource. That's going to bring me into my Recovery Vault, which of course I could have clicked the menu and gone down to Resource Groups and went in through my Resource Group and got there. But here we are on Backup Items Blade. If I click on that, you can see that I have an Azure Virtual Machine scheduled here for backup, but I don't want to wait on that to get scheduled to actually process through. I'm just going to go ahead and force it to backup now. So we're just going to go ahead and trigger that, trigger the backup, and I am going to go ahead and just pause the recording and let that happen. Alright, so I just refreshed and that's finally done. Now I will kind of warn you, this took about 30 minutes. If I go to the menu button here and I go to All Services and we just go to Backup, we can go to the Backup Center. Alright, we can see Backup Jobs here. Alright, and if we drop this down here, we can click on Azure Virtual Machines. We can see that it has completed. It took 31 minutes roughly for it to complete. Alright, so if I click the ellipse symbol and go to View Source, it'll take me straight over to the virtual machine. So I want to talk about some of the things when it comes to troubleshooting a VM backup issue. Number one is, in order for the backup services to work properly, you need to make sure that the server is properly provisioned and started and all that. Now, one of the mistakes that people make is they'll trigger to create a new virtual machine, and then they go ahead and they have a backup schedule that's set to back it up before it's done provisioned and it's not started and all that. So that's the first thing to consider. The second thing to keep in mind is the virtual machine currently dealing with updates, and if it is, the backup service cannot back it up while it's working with updates. Alright, so what I can do here is I can click connect, and I can use RDP to connect into it. So I just download the file and then click connect and put my credentials in, and that'll bring me into the virtual machine. So here is the virtual machine right here. Alright, and I can just connect right into that. So connecting into the virtual machine itself, if I go to Start and I go to Settings, alright, let's get to the right area here. If I go to Start and go to Settings and click on Update and Security, I can just verify that there's currently no updates that are processing through. I do have updates that are pending, but I don't have any updates that are processing through. So, but if I had a failure on a backup, that would definitely be something that I would need to look into. All right. The next thing that needs to be checked if you had a backup failure of a virtual machine would be to make sure that there's no antivirus software that's currently performing a scan. If you have antivirus software that is currently performing a scan, that software might prevent you from performing a backup. So that would be something to keep in mind as well. And a couple things you can do there. Number one, if you're using the Defender antivirus, which is what Microsoft recommends, of course that's their software, and you go to settings here, you'll see update and security. All right, and if you go to Windows Security, you can look at virus and threat protection, and you can see any current threats if it's running. Another thing you can do is I can go to Task Manager, and I can look at the apps that are currently running in background processes, mostly the apps that are running. It'll let you know if it's performing a scan. You can also look at the CPU usage and see what file is affecting you. And that could be the issue there if you're having a backup problem, is dealing with that. All right. So that's a couple things to check. Another thing is if I open up File Explorer here and I go to the C drive on my virtual machine, I have a folder called Windows Azure. I've got a folder called Logs, and then right here Plugins in the Microsoft Azure Cover Services. If that is not there, then there has been a provisioning problem with Azure. All right, with your virtual machine. So it could be that the virtual machine is still being provisioned. You could potentially have set the virtual machine up, but it's connected into it very quickly right as it got set up, and there could still be some of this getting provisioned. So most of the time this is not going to be an issue, just because most people don't try to back up their virtual machine the second it's deployed. But if this folder is not there, that could be an issue. And you might have to install the backup agent software manually, which I'm not getting into in this video, but you can install backup software agents manually. All right, so those are the things that you need to check in regards to the virtual machine. Let's jump out of this virtual machine now. Now I'm going to go and click the menu button, go to Resource Groups, and we're going to click on my storage account RG, which is where my Recovery Services Vault is here. So I'm going to click on that. We're going to go right here to Backup Items, and you can see the Azure Virtual Machine backup here. So a couple other things I can do if there is a failure here. I could tell it to go here to File Recovery and click on a restore point, and you'll see there is a snapshot there. In this case, if I was dealing with a situation where I was trying to restore a backup, it wasn't just that a backup had failed, I could go back and restore to that restore point. Now, if it was a failed backup, we could tell it to stop the backup entirely. So I can just trigger it to stop. And notice it says stop backup level, retain backup data, or delete the backup. Okay, I could say retain the backup data if it's there, then give it a reason. This product has many errors, product is difficult to use, compliance, yada, yada, yada. I can choose whichever of these I want. Okay, and from there, if I want to give it a comment, I can hit stop backup. And that is going to trigger the stopping of this backup schedule. So if there's a backup policy that's got it scheduled to back up, if it was in the process of backing up but it keeps throwing errors, then at that point it's going to tell that to stop. Okay, so as you can see, it's still up here running. So we'll give that just a moment. Okay, so now that that's done, I'm going to click the ellipse symbol here. You can see I have some other options. I have this delete backup data if I want to delete the backup data, resume the backup if I want to start it back up. But if the backup had failed and I wanted to restart it, and again, it could just be because the antivirus software was running on the virtual machine. It could be being updated. But I could then say, I'm just going to say delete the backup data. Okay, and then it says, all right, if you want to delete it, type the name of the backup item. Okay. So the backup item is WinServer1. That's the name. So I'll just paste that in after copying it. Give it a reason. All right. And then from there, click delete. And that is going to trigger a delete. All right. So we'll give that just a moment to stop and delete the backup entirely. Once that completes, you might need to do a refresh here, but you'll see you've got this warning symbol here letting you know there's been an issue, and you'll notice that it's been deleted. So if I wanted to undelete it, I could. So if I want to do that, it says all restore points for this backup item will be undeleted, and the item will come to stop protection with retained data state. You can resume backup to continue the scheduled backup. So days until permanent deletion. So I'll go ahead and undelete that now. All right, and at that point, if I wanted to restart the backup, I could. Okay. All right. So those are essentially the steps that you would consider in dealing with the troubleshooting of the virtual machine backups, looking at the log, checking the various services, making sure there was no issues there, and then looking for any kind of error. Again, try deleting the backup and then restarting the backup to get things going again. The first thing to consider when working with the backup agent in Azure in regards to your operating systems is to think about what's supported. All right, so the backup agent is called MARS, which is the Microsoft Azure Recovery Services agent, and that can be installed on the operating system, but the question would be, what operating systems do we even support? Now, if you do a quick Google or Bing search and just search for the keywords support matrix backup Microsoft Azure Services agent, you can find this article very easily, and we can take a look in this article at what operating systems are supported. So here it is right here, supported operating system types, and you can see the various operating systems that are going to be supported with this MARS agent. So that would be the first thing. Make sure that if you're going to deal with a backup issue, the starting point would be to make sure that the agent itself is supported by whatever operating system you are working with. All right, so you can see the stuff here. You can also see that there's some end-of-life support for some older operating systems. Okay, the next would be to think about the backup limitations on size. So what is the size limits when it comes to this? So Azure Backups limits the size of files or folder data source that can be backed up. They list that here. And then some of the other limitations. MARS does not support protection of multiple machines with the same name to a single vault. So as far as backing up to a recovery services vault, you got to make sure you don't have the same name. All right. So the other thing, supported file types for backup, you got encrypted, compressed, sparse, compressed, and sparse. You have hard links not supported, reparse points not supported. So any kind of files, folders, anything that falls into these categories would not get backed up. Okay, and so that's something to think about. Another thing is supported drives or volumes for backup. Read-only volumes not supported, offline volumes not supported, network shares not supported. It tells you the volume must be a local on the server. BitLocker, locked volumes not supported, file system identification, only supports NTFS, removable media, all backup item sources must have a fixed status, and then deduplicated drives are supported. Okay, so those are some other considerations. The last thing here too of note would be making sure that your firewall is not blocking. So a big part of dealing with backup issues on a with the recovery agent would make sure that your firewall is not blocking these services. I've worked as a consultant for companies before, and I know one of the things that the mistakes they'll be making is they'll be blocking some of these URLs, and the next thing you know, the backup is going to fail. All right, so that would be another thing. So this article is very helpful. It provides some really good information as a good starting point for dealing with issues involving the backup agent. Now, in this demonstration, one thing I want to point out is you could install this on a virtual machine that is on-premise, or a real machine that is on-premise that's not a virtual machine. In my case, just for demo purposes here, I'm just going to use my Azure VM because I've already got that set up and I can get to it real quick. If you don't have a VM, you could just quickly create a server VM. All right, but here I am on portal.azure.com. And I'm just going to click on virtual machines, and I have my Win Server 1 virtual machine, and we're going to connect in using RDP. So we're just going to You download the file and then click connect. Now that I'm in my virtual machine, I'm going to open up my web browser and I'm going to just do a quick search for download Mars agent. Alright, so there's different links that'll take you there, but if you'll notice right here, it says upgrade the Microsoft Azure Mars agent, download the latest version. I'm just going to click this link right here, and if I scroll down a little bit, there is a link for downloading the latest version of the Mars agent, which I've already done just to speed this up, but I'm going to click open after it's done downloading, and that's going to allow me to install this Mars agent on my server here. So we're just letting that wizard pop up. Alright, I'm going to take the defaults as far as where to install it. I'm not using a proxy. Okay, do I want to deal with Microsoft updates on this? No, just for time purposes, and then I'm going to click install. Alright, so it's now installing the Mars agent on this server. So we'll just let that go ahead and just run through. Installing pretty quickly here, but we'll let that go ahead and run through. Once that's done, I'm going to click proceed to registration, and at that point it's going to want what are called vault credentials. So let's talk about how we get vault credentials. We're going to go to portal.azure.com. So we're just in our web browser here. We're going to go to portal.azure.com. All right, and I need to log on. Put in my credentials. Okay. It's going to make me verify with a phone number code. That's just multi-factor authentication kicking in there. So let me just put the code in that it gave me. All right. And now we should be good and authenticated. And so now what we're going to do is jump over to our recovery vault. So we click the menu button here, go to resource groups. I've got a recovery services vault that I've created previously in my storage account RG resource group, and I'm going to go to the recovery vault right here. And then we're going to click backup, go right here to Azure, and say if I want to back up a virtual machine. We're going to treat this as though it's on-premise, though. Again, even though I know this is hosted in this virtual machine is being hosted in Azure, it would be the same process if you're doing this on-premise. So we'll say, okay, I just want to back up some files and folders, prepare infrastructure. I could have downloaded the agent here. I kind of did it the long way, but I've already downloaded the agent, and then now it wants me to download my vault file. So I'll click download, and there's the vault file. So now I've got that. I'm going to go back into my wizard here. We're going to click browse, and we will go back over here to downloads, and there's the vault file. So that vault file is going to basically be an authentication file to prove, that we have access to the account and all that. So we'll click next, and then it says, okay, you need to set a password. Minimum password needs to be 16 characters. This is for authentication purposes. I'm just going to tell it to generate one, and then you can also have a place where you want to save a copy of that file. All right. So if I say, no, just save it to my desktop, you'll notice it says, oh, you're trying to save it to a location, exposing, this is not secure, but I'm going to click yes. Okay. In the real world, you'd want to save that, password file somewhere more secure than that. All right. But we'll let this run through. All right, now that that's done, you get this little warning again. It's not happy that I'm saving the passphrase right there on the desktop, but again, this is just for testing purposes. So it says launch the Microsoft Azure Recovery Agent now. Yes, so we're going to go ahead and do that. Close out, and the Recovery Agent should pop up here on the screen. And at that point, we now have the ability to, set up the backup process and all that fun stuff. So if we want, we've got to schedule a backup. Maybe we want to schedule a backup that we want to run. Go through here, add an item. I'm just going to, let's see, we've got some folders here. We'll just back up this packages folder. Click OK, click next, and then you can go ahead and schedule it. When do you want to schedule it? And schedule a backup. For today. I'm going to schedule it for It says at the following times, 3 times a day, 7:30, you know, whatever time I want. All right. Let's do, how about we do 9 a.m. Okay, and we can have a retention policy, of course, how long it's going to be retained. Not going to get into all that right now. Transfer over the network, that's fine. Click finish, and we've now scheduled a backup to occur. Okay, so now I want to look at if there's issues, troubleshooting issues. So when it comes to troubleshooting the agent, there's a few things to think about here. Okay. First off, if we go into Control Panel, just by doing a Start Search, Control Panel, we're going to go down here to Programs and Features. All right. And if you look right here, you have these various services. What we want to look for is this Microsoft Azure Recovery Services Agent. If there was some kind of a failure, we can check to make sure that's installed. And if there's an issue, we can go here to Uninstall Change. All right. And you can uninstall and reinstall the agent. If there's backup issues and it might involve the agent, that's a way to check that. All right. The next thing I want to do is I want to look at services. All right. So if we go here to right-click Start, we'll open up right here where it says Computer Management. All right. We'll go to Services and Applications and then Services. All right. And so you can look through this list here of the various services that are currently running, and what we want to see is the Azure Recovery Services Management Agent is running, and so is the Recovery Services Agent itself. So these two services need to be up and running in order for backups to go through successfully. All right. So that's the next thing to be thinking about here when it comes to this. All right. Let's go to our File Explorer. Let's go to the C drive, Windows Azure. Okay. Logs. You have plugins. You got this recovery services. That needs to be there as well. For some reason that's not there, corrupted, then that's not a good thing. That might be you might have to go in and install recovery services information manually. Which there's articles out there about dealing with that. All right. But anyway, that's the other thing. So then we've got guest agent is there, everything, this is all, the agent is there. Of course, if you uninstall, reinstall the agent, everything should be there. So that's not really a huge issue, but definitely something to be thinking about. All right. So all that is there. Finally, the next thing we need to do is check our event log. So we're going to right click Start. We're going to go to Event Viewer. All right. Go here to Windows Logs. All right. And we would check our system log. Make sure there's no operating system errors showing up regarding the backup services. Like if a backup service is stopping or starting, not working right, the recovery services for Mars, Microsoft Azure Recovery Services, if there's any kind of errors, we would want to be looking for that. All right. Also, you have the application log. If there was a problem related to this software, the Mars software, then that could show errors here. So we'd want to investigate that also. Okay. I got some warnings, but they're not related to that. Okay. All right. The other thing is if we expand application and service logs, there is a cloud backup log. So we take a look at that. Right now we just got information messages, so that's good. It's just letting us know that the software is there, it's updated, everything's fine. So there's no issues there. There's also Windows Azure. There's any kind of issues here popping up. There's no messages at all at this point, so there's nothing there really to look at, but that'd be something to consider. And then finally, the Microsoft Azure Recovery Services. If we expand that out, click at Replication. If there's any kind of errors and warnings here, we would want to troubleshoot those. Okay. So those are your main culprits that you would want to focus on regarding the virtual machine itself. Now, popping back open our web browser, I wanted to show you something regarding the agent here that we could look for if there was a problem. If we come back over and we go to our resource groups, let's go into storage account RG here, and then go into our recovery vault, my recovery vault. So we'll click on that, and we're going to go down to backup items, and we should have a new item showing up that wasn't there before. And we do. Here it is, Azure Backup Agent. So you can see there is something there. So we'll click on that. And the backup hasn't occurred yet because it's, we have to wait on the backup schedule and all that. But you can see that there is a backup that is going to occur. So we can click View Details on that. If we were getting any kind of error messages or warnings, that's where we would troubleshoot those. But everything right now the backup is just scheduled. So there hasn't been anything that have occurred. But that's the final thing you'd want to check in regards to troubleshooting and dealing with a backup agent issue. I'd like to now discuss the concept of troubleshooting the Azure Backup Server, also known as MABS, Microsoft Azure Backup Server. So you should already be aware of what MABS is. This document that Microsoft has pretty much has everything you need to be aware of involving the troubleshooting process with MABS. MABS is, of course, a piece of software that can be installed on a Microsoft server, and that server can then in turn back up other servers and back up to the Azure environment. It can also work in conjunction with System Center Operations Manager, SCOM. You can find this exact document by doing a quick search on these keywords, MABS Protection Matrix, and Google being whichever. You can find this document very easily that way. But if you look down here, you can look at the different things that we can support for backing up. Okay, so we can back up client operating systems with MABS, 64-bit they tell you. And the various things can be backed up being volumes, shared folders, files, deduplicated volumes, all that. You can back up servers with it. You can back up SQL services if you want. They tell you the various versions of SQL that are supported. So one thing to consider here in dealing with MABS is to know what versions of items you can back up with it. So you can see that pretty much from SQL Server 2014 and higher, you can back that up. Exchange services, Exchange 2016 and higher can all be backed up with this, including the DAGs, the database availability groups that you get with it. You can back up physical, Hyper-V, virtual machines, all of that stuff. SharePoint can be backed up. SharePoint 2016 and higher can all be backed up, whether it's physical server, Hyper-V, VMware, whatever. All right. So the other thing, of course, is virtual machines themselves can be backed up. Hyper-V, Azure Stack virtual machines, VMware, all of those are supported as far as being backed up. Okay. Linux. So you have a different version of Linux here. Linux running as Hyper-V or VMware, you can back that up. All right. Now, when the MABS communicates with Azure, it can communicate with Azure various ways. If you're just going straight across the internet, you definitely want to make sure you have certain URLs that are open. These are the URLs. If you are using ExpressRoute, like they're mentioning here, then these URLs, and then also you have these IP addresses that need to make sure your firewall or any of that is not blocking any of this stuff you see here. All right, so one of the problems with MABS is it could be a firewall. If you had an issue backing up with it, your firewall could be blocking any of these items that you see here. Okay, so that would be something to consider. All right. The other thing would be operating systems and applications. These are end-of-life support, so we're no longer going to be supporting these older versions that you see here. You also can back up clusters. So file servers, SQL servers, Hyper-V, Exchange, SQL, all of that, SQL Server, Azure Backup, they tell you server does not support backing up SQL database hosted on a clustered shared volume. So that's a CSV, clustered shared volume scenario with when it comes to clustering with SQL. All right, so here's some of the issues to keep in mind. First off, MABS can't back up VMs using shared drives. So if you've got a shared drive where you've got a drive that's attached to multiple VMs, can't back that up. Okay. Another thing would be if you're going to protect a shared folder,
The path of the shared folder includes a logical path on volume. It says if you move the shared volume, protection will fail. If you must move a protected shared folder, remove it from the protection group and then add it to protection after the move. All right. So that would involve what's called a protected shared folder. You also can't change the domain of a protected computer either. That's another thing. So if you had a computer like, let's say you had a server called NYC Server 1, and it's .examlabpractice.com, and you decided to change the domain name of it's not going to work. Okay? You can't change the domain of a protected computer. You can't change the name of the protected computer and continue without disruption. So you'd have to remove it and then re-add it in order to do a backup if you change the name of the computer. MABs also automatically will identify the time zone of the computer during its installation. If a protected computer is moved to a different time zone after you've set this up, you need to make sure that you change the computer time in Control Panel. Then you can update the time zone in MAB's database. So that's another consideration. So another reason why an issue might be backing up a machine might be time zone. All right. MABs can also protect workloads in the same domain as the MAB server or in a child or trusted domain. So there's got to be a trust relationship there. And it can back up SQL Server, File Server, Hyper-V, all of that. All right, things that are not supported. You can't do hard link backups. So if you got any kind of hard link data, that's basically almost like shortcuts, if you're familiar with those, from one place to the other. Data that's using a hard link is not supported. Reparse points, mount points, data mounted in volumes within mount points, recycling bin, page files, system volume, in other words, sysvol, non-NTFS volumes, files containing hard links or symbolic links, data on file shares, sharing UPDs, files within any combination attributes encrypted and reparse, any of this stuff here. I wouldn't really stress over this stuff right here much, worrying about knowing that. But definitely know about the NTFS rule. That's important. Can't back up recycling bin, can't back up page files using it. All right. So those are the big things to be aware of. Nothing too hardcore here. If I had to put a label on the things I would know that are most important, I definitely would know these URLs have to be available. The IP addresses have to be available, though I wouldn't bother memorizing these. And then know what is these issues here. MABs can't back up shared drives. Can't change the domain. You can change the computer, but you have to remove and add it. And then the time zone thing. Those are the big key ingredients of things I would recommend you know when it comes to dealing with MAB issues. Let's talk now about the issues involving scheduled backups. So what I want to do now is take a look in the Backup Center. Now you'll see I've got Backup Center right here. That's because I've recently gone there, but if I don't have this available, I can just click the menu button, go to All Services, and just do a search for the word Backup, and I can see Backup Center available. From there, what I want to do is I want to take a look at backup policies. So backup policies is what's going to ultimately control scheduled backups. And I have a couple here already. I can click Add, though, and I can choose what kind of data source am I backing up. Is it Azure Virtual Machines? Is it Azure Files? Storage? What is it going to be? So I'll choose Azure Files, and from there I can select the vault, which is the My Recovery Vault that I've created earlier. I'm going to click Continue. Give it a name. Just going to call this Demo Policy. Okay. And then I can set the frequency, right? So daily, hourly, whatever. Okay. Set the time zone that I want to whatever I want there. We'll just set it to Eastern Time. So let's go back and find that. There it is. And then from there I can set my retention. So retention of daily backup point, retention of weekly backup point. So this is how long it's going to keep the backup, right? So I could say, Sunday, 12 weeks, retention monthly. I could set a monthly retention and then a retention yearly if I want to do that. Set that to what I want, and then I can click Create. Okay. Now, the things to understand involving troubleshooting when it comes to the policy, first off is in looking at my policy, okay, if we come back over, go back up to the menu, go to all services, search for backup. The backup center, of course, is going to be the place to go to see everything all in one place. All right, so that's very helpful. My policy hasn't shown up here yet, and that's just because you have to be patient with Azure. It does take some time. But ultimately, we do have a couple things to consider here when it comes to troubleshooting scheduled backups. First, you'll notice that I have a default policy right there. All right, the default policy would be set to generally do a daily backup of whatever it may be. If you're talking about this, in this case, it's a virtual machine. So a daily backup would involve, backing up a virtual machine. The retention period is set to, you'll see at 12:30 a.m. and it will retain that for 30 days. So the first thing to understand there is thinking in regards to, well, how long is my backup going to be retained? Because one of the mistakes that a lot of times people make is they want to go back in time and restore a backup that's no longer available, and it could be because the retention period has expired. So think about the retention period first up, okay? Know what the retention period is of your backups, okay? The next would be this enhanced policy that I have here. If I click on that enhanced policy, you can see that's set to hourly. Sets to 8 a.m., and it does this every 4 hours. So it starts at 8 a.m. and it does it every 4 hours, and the duration is for 12 hours. Okay. And then the retention period is also set for 30 days on that one. Okay. So that's the other thing. Now, the other consideration is what are we talking about in regards to what we're backing up? Well, in this case, we've got virtual machines. We've also got an Azure file share. If I click the menu button here and I go back to resource groups, let's go into the storage account RG, and then I've got my recovery vault. And then if I click on backup items, I can see the different various things here that I'm dealing with in regards to backup. I have Azure Virtual Machines. I also have an agent, the Mars agent, and then the storage Azure file, which is an images folder that I'm backing up. And then my backup policies regarding this can be found right here, okay? And you'll see that I have some other policies that are related specifically to this vault. And I want to see all of them right here. This is where I can go to see all the ones that are specific to this vault. So you've got the default ones, okay? And then you've got the demo policy here that I created just a moment ago. All right, there's the enhanced. And then there were some that I created when I was just setting up the backup share. So you got to know what your backup policies are in regards to recovery vault that you're working with, okay? Now, here's something else. Troubleshooting wise, these are the key things you need to remember. Number one is that VMs must be in the same region as your subscription and recovery vault. Okay, so if my recovery vault was in East US, but my VM was in West US, I would not be able to back that up. And that's one of the big mistakes that a lot of times people make, is that they've set their recovery vault up in a different region, and now they're wondering why they're unable to back up their VM. Okay, so that's important. Okay, another thing would be if you get any kind of a message. So let's go back over to our log data. If we go Backup Center, all right, and we look at our backup jobs, if we get an error that says something along the lines of your recovery point is going through crashes due to a VM not responding, it's usually because the VM is turned off. So you need to make sure that your virtual machine is turned on. Any kind of an error talking about a virtual machine not being able to be backed up because it's not responding, you need to check the VM to make sure that the virtual machine is up and running, okay? So how do we do that? Well, we go to the virtual machine itself, right? Wherever the virtual machine is at. We can click the menu button. We can go to virtual machines. I only have one, so I would click on that, and I would make sure that the virtual machine is started, which it is, because I could stop it, right? But it is started already, okay? So that's another one that you need to look at and think about. All right, so you always check the logs, verify the messages, the error messages, know what your backup policy is, okay, and make sure that your virtual machines are started. There isn't really a whole lot of other issues that you'll have to deal with that involves scheduling a backup. Any other considerations we've already gone over would be involving that as well. So we've talked about the backup process. If the backup was to fail, always view the logs, but also consider if it's being scheduled. One of the mistakes people make is they schedule a backup, and then they're wondering why their data is not backed up. 9 times out of 10, it's because the schedule hasn't gone through yet. You can force a backup to just go ahead and trigger now, but if you've set a backup schedule, if you're wondering why is it backed up, it's probably because the schedule hasn't gone through. All right, but those are the things to think about. There isn't really too much there to remember. The key things that I would remember, if I could say, hey, if I could only tell you 2 things that I want you to remember from this video 100%, don't forget. Number 1, virtual machines must be in the same region and same subscription as your recovery vault. Number 2, if you get an error about a VM trying to be backed up and it's saying that the VM is not responding, it's probably because the VM is not started. The first thing to think about when dealing with troubleshooting site recovery issues is understanding what's allowed, what's not allowed, and some of the common issues people run into regarding this. And a lot of that can be found right here in this document. So before I jump into Azure, I just want to show you this, and you can pull this article up just by simply doing a Google or Bing search and on these keywords here about networking and Azure VM disaster recovery. So you can find this article, all right. And so let's say you're going to support site recovery. Maybe you're going to replicate a VM. You have a source environment like the East US, and maybe you're wanting to replicate your source virtual machine out to maybe West US or something like that. Or you're in a situation where you have an on-premise environment and you're wanting to replicate VMs from the on-premise environment out to the cloud. All right. So you kind of have to think about what environment you're talking about here in regards to dealing with this type of issue. Now, the number one thing that I want you to remember here, and this has been the case with a lot of these different services, is you got to make sure that your firewall services are not blocking anything outbound here. The biggest mistake people make that can cause issues that make you have to troubleshoot a site recovery is, let's say you're replicating something from the on-premise environment out to Azure and you've got these domain names, these URLs blocked. So you got to make sure that your firewall services of whatever you're using in regards to firewall, some kind of application level firewall, is not blocking these URLs. Okay, so that's the first thing to keep in mind. I'd say one of the biggest ones to think about. The other thing is when you are replicating virtual machines from one site to another, maybe within Azure, you have NSGs to consider, network security groups. These network security groups are IP filters that could be blocking the services. Now, that's an easy fix. You jump into the NSG and make sure that there's a certain rule there that can allow it. You have to make sure that port 443, because it is going to be using HTTPS, you have to make sure that rule is allowed. All right. So we'll jump in just a second. We'll jump into Azure and we'll take a look at making sure that's in place if you're going to replicate between locations. So here is an example. You have NSG East US, created NSG rule, outbound rule for 443. For this, you can name it whatever you want, but they've named it storage.eastus on the NSG shown here. And then create an outbound rule for Azure Active Directory on NSG as listed here. This is just making sure that port 443 is open on both sides. And then if you are replicating to, in this case, Central US, you have to have an outbound rule for that as well, so that replication is going to be allowed outbound on both ends. All right. So it's basically the same thing on both sides. All right. So those are the ground level criteria I would say to think about. That's one of the biggest mistakes when people set this up. They try to get this working and it's not working, it's not replicating or whatever. It involves these two big things. Number one being the URLs to consider, making sure your firewall is not blocking that if you're replicating from on-premise out to the cloud. Number two, if you're replicating something between different Azure sites within Azure, making sure that 443 is open outbound on both sides. If I go to portal.azure.com and I click the menu button here, and I'm going to go to my virtual machine. I have a virtual machine here called VM1 right now that I created earlier. This might not be something you have in your environment, but all you need is a VM to see what I'm talking about. And if I go to networking, I can see that I have a network interface linked to this. And if I click on that network interface, I can see the IP configuration and all that. You can see that you're using this IP address, and there is this thing called a network security group. A network security group is what controls the IP filtering for the NIC. So if I click on that, currently I don't have a network security group. So it's not performing any kind of filtering or any of that in this case. And ultimately, though, with a lot of virtual machines, you are going to have a network security group that's automatically enabled. And you got to make sure that it is not blocking port 443. In fact, if I just go and let's go to all services, and we will, let's just do a search for network security group. You'll see there is network security group right there. All right, and I do have one right here. And right here is inbound, outbound. So you got to make sure that outbound is not blocking port 443. And as you can see, right now, outbound is not. It is allowing any VNet out on any port. Allow all internet on any port. Okay, so we are fine. But if somebody's gone in there and they've kind of tweaked any of these rules and you're blocking a bunch of ports, you got to make sure that port 443, which is HTTPS, is not being blocked. Okay. So those are the two main things to keep in mind if you're going to start up a virtual machine replication of any sort. For on-premise, you got to make sure all this is open. Port 443 is open. And then for your VNets and all of that for Azure replication, you got to make sure that port 443 is open on the NSG. All right. So those are the considerations in regards to doing a site recovery with Azure. All right, I am going to get into the concepts now of being able to replicate for site replication, site recovery, meaning I can replicate Azure VMs to other places. I can also replicate on-premise Hyper-V VMs to other places, and we're going to talk about the process of doing that. So I'm just going to go to the menu button here, and I'm going to go to virtual machines. There it is. Click Create. And pretty much been wiping out my other stuff here, but I'm going to create a new virtual machine and resource group. Okay, this resource group, I'm going to call it East US RG. Okay, because it's going to be tied to the East US resource group. Virtual machine is just going to be called VM1. Okay, very creative name. And no availability zone or any of that. Get rid of that. We'll just make it a Windows 2022. Standard size is fine. Go ahead and set my admin credentials. Alright, does help if you don't typo it. There we go. All that looks fine. Disks, I'm going to go with standard. Hard disk drives. Nothing really here on networking. We'll just leave all that default. Alright, we can enable the auto shutdown. I like this just because it makes sure that I don't leave my VMs running all the time. I'll set that for 7 p.m. That's fine. Okay, and not going to do any kind of diagnostics or anything. I'm click Review and Create. And once this is done validating, I'm going to go ahead and click Create, and I'll just pause the recording while that's happening. Okay, now that is done, I'm actually going to go to the menu button here and go to All Services. We're going to create a new recovery vault. So I'm just going to do a search for the word vault, and there it is, Recovery Services Vault. And we're going to click to create a new vault here. All right, and I'm going to also create a new resource group. This is going to be called the West US Resource Group. From there, we're going to call this West US Recovery Vault. All right, just give it that name, and we're going to choose the location is going to be West US. There it is. We're going to click Review and Create. Click Create. And I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording while that's creating. Once the recovery vault is done creating, I can click Go to Resource, and that'll bring me here. All right, and so the next thing I want to do is go down here to Site Recovery. It's right up under Protected Items. So I'm going to click on, under Getting Started. So I'm going to click on Site Recovery, and so this is actually where I could, if I wanted to choose to back up an Azure virtual machine, I can do that here. I can also back up VMware virtual machines in Azure, as well as on-premise Hyper-V. So I can go through this set of steps here. It'll have me download some software and put it on Hyper-V, and I can actually back up data from my Hyper-V environment on-premise into Azure. But let's look at Azure virtual machines. We're going to click Enable Replication. And we have our East US region and our resource group. Keep in mind, sometimes if you come in here really quick after you've just created the vault and all of that, it may not show everything, so you might have to refresh your browser. But resource group here, so the East US region, our resource group, and then from there, we're not doing anything with this availability zone feature, so we're clicking Next, and from there I can choose my virtual machine, which is called VM1. We're going to go ahead and click Next. All right, and then the target location would be West US, right? Target resource group will be West US RG, and it's going to create a little virtual failover network for it that'll kind of match the virtual network that the virtual machine is on. That's fine. You can adjust the storage for this if you want. I'm just going to keep the storage the same. You can also adjust availability options if you want. Availability set, which allows you to have multiple replicas of your VM in the same data center on different equipment racks, but I'm just going to leave that alone. And then capacity, this lets you confirm or reserve capacity in their data center. You can reserve guaranteed capacity. That basically means the scenario would be if for some reason the data center was full and there was no resources left, it wouldn't fail over for you. It's a cheaper solution to go with that, but you can also go with select a capacity. But from there, I'm going to go ahead and click Next, and it's got a retention policy, 24-hour retention. It's going to keep, you would be able to backtrack for the 24 hours if you wanted. All right, and I'm going to click Next, and we're going to go ahead and click Enable Replication. All right, and so that is how we can set up replication of an Azure VM between sites. All right, now that we have our Recovery Services Vault set up with our VM to support site replication, I want to trigger a failover and just have this happen here. So here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to click on Recovery Services Vault, which again, I can always get to that by going to the menu and All Services and searching for it. We'll go there. We have a Recovery Services Vault called West US Recovery Vault, and that is where our virtual machine replication and all that's going on. We can see that by going over here to Replicated Items. And then from there, there's our VM. Everything looks healthy. Currently, it's in East US, but we can replicate it to West US. All right. So from there, I'm going to go ahead and click Failover. All right. And so we're failing over from the East US to the West US. It says their reserve capacity is available, so there's plenty of capacity. And then I can also tell it to shut down the machine before failing over if I want. But all right, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And I'm going to go ahead and let this thing fail over. I'll pause the video recording while this is happening. All right, so our virtual machine failover is complete. You can see right here it says failover complete. I don't think I've got any errors or anything, no errors. Check this out. We'll go over here to our resource groups. And the virtual machine originally was running in the East US resource group. But as you can see, the virtual machine in East US is currently shut down. See, it wouldn't give me the option to start if it was running, right? Let's go over to resource groups again. We'll go to West US and look at VM1, and as you can see, it is started. So the virtual machine is up and running in West US. All right. All right. Now hopefully that gives you a good understanding of the failover process and setting up the site recovery when it comes to VM replication. Now finally, when it comes to troubleshooting issues regarding all of this, you definitely want to consider the following. Number one, you would want to go to the menu button, go to All Services, go to the Backup Center, and check your backup jobs. Look for any kind of errors, failures, in progress, any kind of messages you've got there. Number two, check your virtual machines themselves. If you're talking about virtual machine replication, view the event log and look at the applications log to verify that there's any kind of errors or warnings there. And then you could troubleshoot based on the error messages. The main thing here to take away as far as troubleshooting this type of issue, make sure the setup is done correctly, which you've seen me do that. Make sure you're not blocking anything through the firewall, the URLs, all that good stuff. Make sure the port rules are set up properly in your NSGs. If that's not right, you need to fix that. And then lastly, verify and check all your logs. I'd like to now get into the concepts here involving troubleshooting site recovery. So this would involve multiple situations, one being I'm in a hybrid environment where I'm trying to replicate maybe virtual machines from my on-premise environment out to Azure. It could also involve some replication from site to site within Azure, and so there's a couple of things that you want to consider involving this. So first off, here we are talking about troubleshooting site recovery with Hyper-V specifically. So in a hybrid environment, maybe where you've got Hyper-V virtual machines that are needing to replicate, there's sort of a checklist of things to consider here. Number one being, make sure the requirements and prerequisites are met for using the site recovery. If you go into your recovery services vault and go to site recovery, they've got the requirements listed there for setting this up. Secondly, Hyper-V host, if they are being managed by VMM. Now, if you're not familiar with VMM, that's System Center Virtual Machine Manager, and it's a product that you can purchase that is installed on premise, and its main goal is to manage multiple Hyper-V servers. You can also actually manage VMware with it as well, but if you had multiple Hyper-V host servers, then VMM is going to help you manage those. And the thing to remember here is that you got to have at least one cloud set up with one or more host groups, and that's just something you would learn if you were working with VMM. You have to create what's called a cloud inside VMM to represent all this, and then you have to have at least one host group for this in order for site replication, all that to work, involving SCVMM, System Center Virtual Machine Manager. All right. Next thing to mention here would be Hyper-V host running VMs should be in the cloud with network mapping between on-premise VMs and Azure network virtual networks. And so that involves having a way for replication to occur from the on-premise out to the cloud, either with like a VPN gateway or with a express route. And you got to make sure you got connectivity with the proper ports open. Of course, I'll mention that more here in just a moment. And then another thing for troubleshooting would be to check your logs within your virtual machines, because in order for site replication and all that to work, if it was to have problems, it's going to generate log events inside the applications and services logs, the Windows system logs. There's also the recovery services log that's inside the applications and services logs. All right. Next up would be on the guest virtual machines themselves. Again, make sure that you have the latest version of integrated services installed. So that's one of the things with Hyper-V. You install what's called integrated services, and you want to make sure you got the latest and greatest version, because it could be that Azure is not compliant with maybe an out-of-date version of integrated services for Hyper-V. Okay, then we got troubleshooting site recovery with VMware. So it's a nice little checklist here. First off, when it comes to VMware, if you're working with VMware, verify you got certain properties. Verify the properties are compliant with Hyper-V. So you can check the protected items, the select, you can look in replicated items, and then select the virtual machine that you want to look at inside of VMware. And then in the replicated items pane, there's a summary of virtual machine information that's going to provide you with health status. It's also going to let you know what the recovery point services point are involving Hyper-V. All right, I'm sorry, VMware. And then in the computing and networking area in VMware, you can also verify the Azure name that you're connected to, resource group, target size, availability group, manage disk information, and all that. So you just want to make sure all that matches up. If you got some kind of replication problems, you want to start by checking all of that, and then making sure your network mapping and settings and all that are configured correctly, making sure that you don't have certain ports blocked, URLs blocked, firewall settings blocking something, and make sure all that checks out. Okay. And so the other thing is within disk in VMware, you want to review operating system information and data disk and make sure all that is saying that it's connected properly with Azure. So those are just a few things you would check involving VMware. Now another problem that you can run into is if you've got a high data rate change of some kind. So what can happen is that your Azure Site Recovery can generate an event if there's a data change rate on your source virtual machine that ends up being higher than like a supported rate. And so what happens is you can see whether or not the problem is because of maybe a high churn rate trying to replicate basically data being churned out. You can go in and look for events in the last 72 hours. That's what you're seeing in the picture there on the left. And you can click on the event in your log, and you can look for the event number you see right there on the right, which involves a data change rate beyond supported limits. So what you want to do there, if that's happening, it probably means that you've got a virtual machine's disk that's being heavily utilized while you're trying to use replication. And what you need to consider is upping the performance of that disk. So if you're like me and you're a cheapskate, when it comes to setting up these disks, sometimes I'm only that way because a lot of the consulting work that I've done, I'm working with people that are on tight budgets. I go with the slower disk, but you could run into a problem where if you went with the slower disk, you've got you're generating this this issue with high churn rate. Due to the fact the disk is being heavily used and being replicated. So you might have to up the performance of the disk, okay, in order to solve that problem. And then the last thing I want to mention here is just the network connectivity. So you got to make sure that you're not blocking any URLs or IP addresses that Azure needs. And of course, if you go into the getting started in the area of the recovery services vault that you set up, it tells you right there that you have to have port 443 open. Your VMs have to have that going outbound, and you got to make sure you got that. If you're doing this on premise in a hybrid environment, you got all that open outbound, and the Azure URLs cannot be blocked. So those are all things you got to check. Your network security group and your that are set up involving your VMs. If you have any NSGs set up for your VMs, you got to make sure they're allowing port 443 and all that outbound. All right, and that's going to take care of the network issues, okay? So those are the things that I definitely would say, hey, you got to check when troubleshooting issues involving site recovery in a hybrid environment. I now want to go through the process of helping you understand VNets and subnets. Now, the first thing I want to say in regards to Azure and virtual networks is that if you have an understanding of just how physical networking works, even in like a traditional on-premise environment where you have to have what are called subnets, and you're running a TCP/IP based network. Granted, it's still to this day, even though we do have TCP/IP version 6 out there, the majority of everything that's running is still TCP/IP version 4, which is what Azure is running and kind of what we're focused on here. Your virtual networking concept is very, very much like on-premise networking. So the same kind of concepts that you have learned and used in the on-premise side of things
in regards to TCP/IP is pretty much what you're going to find is running in Azure. All right. Now, when you start using resources, there are all sorts of types of resources out there that communicate and work on a virtual network, or VNet as it's called. All right. Of course, virtual machines are going to have VNICs, and those VNICs are going to interact. Virtual Network Interface cards is what that stands for. They're going to interact on the virtual networks. All right. Now, the virtual network is within Azure, within their Azure networking space, and it's able to route traffic across that virtual network and communicate with the internet if you attach public IP addresses and all of that. And the virtual networks even have a DHCP service, a Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol service, that will issue out the addresses that you set up in the address space that you have. So what I want to do now, I want to draw some of this out and help you visualize it before jumping in and using it. Okay, so we'll start by setting up a VNet in this graphic. Now, the VNet is going to represent a network as a whole, all right? And we'll say that this rectangle is going to represent the VNet as a whole. A VNet is going to be made up of an address space, all right? An entire range of addresses that make up the whole virtual network, all right? So I might call this VNet, we'll call it VNet A. All right, let me lower the font down just a little bit here because it's taking up a little bit too much room, but we'll call this VNet A, all right? So let's see, there we go. And basically VNet A, the address space will be, let's say, from, we'll say 10.1.00/16. Now, I'm not here to teach you TCP/IP. You kind of have to have a little bit of an understanding of TCP/IP coming into this, but that if you do the math on that in TCP/IP, there's basically 65,000 addresses that would be available within this address space. Okay, this is a very common type of address space in a private network that you use. The /16 means that this would have a subnet mask of 255.255.0.0. Okay, and that would make up basically 65,000. There'd be a total of 65,536 addresses. You have to really subtract a couple there, but roughly 65,000 addresses. However, we're not going to need 65,000 addresses on all of our given subnets, because ultimately, here's the thing: you have your virtual network, which is this square as a whole, but then you have to set up what are called subnets. Just like in traditional TCP/IP networks, you have the network as a whole that might represent the whole network, and then you might have subnets that go inside that network. Okay, so from there, I might have, let's say this right here will represent, this is going to represent a subnet, and we'll call this subnet A. All right. And so from there, it might be 10.1.1.0/24. Okay, so you're slicing off a piece of that 65,000 chunk of addresses by doing that. You're basically saying that you're going to roughly have 256 addresses. Actually, in TCP/IP, you probably know this. If you know TCP/IP, you have to subtract 2. You can't use the very first address on an addressing system, and you can't use the very last address. The very first address represents what is called the network address in TCP/IP, and the very last address is what we call the broadcast address. So in reality, you would have a range of addresses that would be available: 10.1.1.1 to 10.1.1.254. Now, Azure also does reserve a couple of other addresses for itself, but I'm not going to get into that right now. That would be your actual range that would be available. So the virtual machines and all that go on this virtual network would be able to take those addresses, and you'd have a DHCP service that would handle this for each service, each subnet automatically. All right. So then I might have another subnet over here. Let's create another subnet, and we'll call this subnet B. All right. And then maybe subnet B is going to be 10.1.2.0/24. which means you would have a range of 10.1.2.1 to 10.1.2.254. That would be your range, all right, of addresses that are available on that subnet, okay? And then, of course, let's say you want to have another subnet. We'll say subnet C over here. Each subnet could contain different virtual machines, and you could be putting them on different subnets for that purpose. One of the reasons for putting things on different subnets and not just doing one big subnet is that you could have security rules and stuff for that specific subnet if you want, but not getting into the IP filtering just yet. So then subnet C might be 10.1.3.0/24. Hopefully you're seeing a pattern here. And you would basically have a 10.1.3.1 to 10.1.3.254, and that would be your range. So again, you can put your different virtual machines on these subnets, and from there they would be able to communicate. One of the interesting things about having subnets in the same VNet is that they can automatically talk to each other. So, for example, if you had a virtual machine here, we'll say this is a VM. And of course, virtual machines have VNICs. A VNIC is going to be the object that represents the adapter card for that virtual machine. That VNIC would automatically get an address from the DHCP service that the VNet uses. Okay, and then if I had another virtual machine down here and maybe another virtual machine over here, all of these could talk to each other automatically. They could automatically communicate. They could automatically talk to each other, and traffic could flow between those different subnets. That's automatic. Now there is this thing that is called an NSG. An NSG is called a network security group. NSG. All right, I'm going to put a little square around it. NSGs are IP filtering capabilities. And what they basically do is they can restrict traffic from flowing to one place to the other if we want. NSGs can be placed either directly on a VNIC or they can be placed on a subnet as a whole. So for example, if I had some kind of VM here and I really needed to lock down what could talk to it, maybe I want the virtual machine in subnet A to talk to this VM, but not the one in subnet B. I could actually do that by using NSG. I could place the NSG on the whole subnet and restrict this VM from talking to the whole subnet, or I could just place it on this VNIC and restrict this guy from talking to this VNIC. And of course that can include things coming from the internet and all of that stuff as well. All right. Because of course that is the other thing that I'm not looking at just yet, but you can assign public IP addresses to all this too, and you can allow things from the internet to get in. In this case right now, since I don't have any kind of public IP address, there's nothing that's actually talking from the internet to these machines. All right. These machines can actually go out to the internet if you want them to, but things can't flow in from the internet. All right. So kind of summarizing what we're seeing here, we've got a VNet called VNet A, and we've only got one VNet, and we've set the whole entire range, which is 10.1.00. Now, if you were to actually think about that whole range, you would have 10.1.0.1 generally up to 10.1.255.254. That would be the full range, the full 65,000 range. And what these subnets are doing is they're breaking these up into smaller chunks, smaller, more manageable chunks. The general rule of thumb, most people kind of go by this. You don't have to go by this, but the general rule of thumb is your subnet should be /24 based. That's 255.255.255.0 on the subnet mask, which gives you roughly 254 addresses, even though Azure does reserve a few more than that. You get roughly 250 when it's all said and done, okay? Depending upon what Azure reserves for itself for routing traffic. All right. But again, all of these subnets by default will be able to communicate with each other because they're part of the same VNet. And the NSG could be used to restrict that. Now, don't think of an NSG as a firewall. It is an IP filtering system, which is something firewalls can do. But Microsoft actually has a thing called the Azure Firewall that handles the more intense stuff in regards to securing things. All right. Now, this is just looking at this from the perspective of a single VNet. All right. Now, in your enterprise, you might have multiple VNets that are associated with different projects and things like that that you're working on. So what I want to do now is I want to look at this from the perspective of not just one VNet, but multiple VNets. All right, so looking at this from a larger standpoint here, imagine you've got multiple VNets that you're working with. Maybe you've got different projects going on, and each project is dealing with its own VNet. There's various things you could do here, but so we'll do this. We'll say that this represents our first VNet here. All right, we'll call this, instead of VNet A, we're going to call them VNet. We'll do VNet 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. Okay, so VNet 1, and we'll say that the range is going to be, put the range up here for this, 10.1.00/16. All right, and then let's do, we'll say VNet 2, and the range will be the 10.2.00/16. All right. And we'll do, make that a little bit smaller because I want to fit one more in there. VNet 3 is going to be 10.3.00/16. And then we'll do one more over here. Try to fit that in. And that will be VNet 4. All right, 10.4.00/16, and we'll just kind of center this stuff a little bit better. Move this over a little, move this out here a little bit. Okay, now this is actually a pretty common scenario too, where you might have what is known as a hub and spoke scenario. A hub and spoke scenario might be where you've got, you know, one main VNet where sort of is the hub where everything comes in, and then different spoke VNets that are interacting with that hub VNet. All right, and so of course now you've also got to consider you've got some subnets that can fit onto this, right? So maybe we've got, let's do this. We'll say this. This is going to be, we'll call this subnet 1A, and maybe the range for that would be 10.1.1.0/24. And then maybe we've got another subnet over here, and we'll say this is subnet 1B, and this will be 10.1.2.0/24. So we're just slicing this up into chunks of 254, roughly 250, when it's all said and done, from this full range here. And then of course you can do the same thing on these subnets over here. You could have you know, subnet 2A, and this would be 10.2.1.0. You can use the 10.2.0 subnet as well, but I like to do it that way. I like to use the 1 because it's the first letter of the alphabet if I'm naming this. But so then we could do another here. All right, we'll say subnet 2B, and that would be 10.2.2.0. You see the pattern, I'd imagine, at this point. And then over here, let's just keep it simple. Let's just give each one of these, we'll just give them one subnet. All right, so then we'll say this is going to be subnet 3A, and that'll be 10.3.1.0/24. And then we'll do the same thing over here. We'll just keep it simple and give it one subnet, and it'll be subnet 4A, and then that would be 10.4.1.0/24. Okay, so this is my strategy. Now, the other thing I want to clarify is that you have to consider the fact that you may at some point connect your on-premise network with Azure, and you got to make sure the addressing system that you're using in Azure does not conflict with the addressing system that you're using on-premise. That's very important. It's a huge pain if you've got conflicts. So if you're using this addressing system on your internal network, you don't want to be using that in Azure. You want to use something different. This is why we use the 10, because a lot of companies are using the 192.168 or the 172.16 strategy on their on-premise network. All right. So just think about that. All right. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is that that even though these subnets can talk to each other and these two subnets can talk to each other, essentially none of the subnets can cross VNets at this time. So unfortunately, the thing you got to understand about all of this is that when you have separate VNets, they don't automatically have routing between them. Okay, like up here, these subnets are all part of the same VNet. They've automatically got what is known as system routing enabled. And so they automatically can route traffic between these different subnets. But down here, we don't have that automatically. Okay, so there is a way to handle that, and it's a thing called peering. All right, peering allows traffic to flow between the different VNets. All right, so I can actually create this thing called a peering. And peering actually happens from both sides here. That's why I'm drawing these two little arrows. If I want, and this is traditional. If you're doing a hub and spoke type scenario, you would do it this way. Instead of connecting them all together, I'm going to make everything travel through the hub. Now, in the hub VNet, what I might do is I might have what's called the Azure Firewall. And the Azure Firewall can basically police traffic flowing between the VNets. All right. Now keep in mind, you can still have NSGs, which will do IP filtering and all of that, but the NSG is not a full-blown firewall. It just does what's called packet filtering. If you want to police things, maybe you've got here's the internet right here. All right. Let me just kind of get rid of the little thought bubble thing here that it puts on there. But let's say this is the internet, okay, and you're trying to allow traffic to flow, from the internet into your Azure environment, which you very well can do. You can set up a public IP address and all that. You might set up a Azure firewall. All right, we'll say Azure firewall right here. This is what we call a virtual appliance, and it might be hooked into that subnet, and you might have a PIP, a public IP address, coming in here. And what happens is traffic trying to flow to any of these other subnets. Maybe you've got some virtual machines. Let's just copy this just to keep it simple. Maybe you got a virtual machine here, and you got a virtual machine over here. Maybe you got this is a web server or something like that, and you're having to police traffic flowing in. Everything would have to flow through this Azure firewall before it could get to any of these VMs. And same thing, if you wanted to allow these various virtual machines to communicate with each other, maybe you're going to allow this guy to communicate with this guy over here. You can make it where everything's got to go through this firewall. So Azure, once you set your peerings up, and let me just kind of clarify in my diagram that that's what those lines are real quick. All right. So this is a peering, right? This is a peering, and this is a peering. Once you've set that up, you've got two peerings really, because it's a send and receive. You can actually make it where you can send traffic from a VNet to another VNet, but you can't receive traffic. That's something else you can do. But in this case, I'm allowing traffic to flow both ways. But anyway, I can use these things called UDRs, which is called a user-defined route. Okay, a user-defined route, UDR, user-defined route. This will allow me to direct traffic and force traffic to go through something if I want. In other words, I can make it where, any of these
these guys right here, any of these subnets want to talk to each other, they have to flow through the Azure firewall. I can use this thing called a user-defined route to control that traffic. All right, if I want. So maybe I've got, I've got virtual machines on each one of these subnets here. All right. Ooh, just barely fit, but it did fit. And I can require everything to have to go through that Azure firewall if I want. The other thing I can have is I can have load balancers and everything else. You can have you can do what is known as virtual load balancing, which is really neat. And you could maybe, if you were in a situation where you had a web server here and a web server here and a web server here, and you wanted a load balance between those three, you could do that. All right. And then finally, again, talking about our on-premise network, this triangle is going to represent your on-premise network. Maybe your company has a Microsoft domain, and the symbol of a triangle is always going to represent a domain. All right. So this is what we call ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, and that is on-premise. All right. We have various ways that we can actually connect an on-premise network into Azure. One of the things we can do is we can do this thing called a VPN gateway. All right, a VPN gateway, VPN GW here. A VPN gateway is another type of appliance that we can have. All right, and it can establish a connection with an on-premise domain, so traffic can flow securely into this VPN gateway. And really what's happening, just to give you a better look at it, is it's really, you would have to have a what's called a VPN concentrator, and that VPN concentrator would be on premise. Let's make it orange. It would be on premise, right? And this VPN concentrator could establish a internet connection, and then from that internet connection, you could connect it into this VPN gateway. And from there, traffic can flow from on-premise directly into your subnets if you want. There's another solution that will connect everything together called Express Route. So again, this is called Express Route. Some people will call it a direct route or a direct connection into Azure. But what you basically do is you work with a telecommunication provider, and they install hardware at your office. And what that basically does is it uses the telecommunication private network and connect directly into Azure that way. So you can use a VPN concentrator to do what's called a VPN gateway and connect into Azure. It uses the internet, so it's virtually private, or you can use a direct connection from your on-premise environment into the cloud as well. So those, and of course that's going to be the more expensive route to go, but you have a private connection through the telecommunications provider with Azure, and you can have insanely from speeds of 10 gigabits per second up to 100 gigabits per second in certain regions. If you spend the money. Of course, again, you're talking some serious money when you start getting into that. All right. So hopefully these drawings, I know this is a bit of a mess, but hopefully this drawing gives you a better, at least a visualization now of kind of how all this sort of works together. I know I haven't really explained doing any of this yet through Azure, but now at least you can kind of visualize it before jumping in and doing it. I want to get into some of the issues we can run into regarding VPN gateways and basically transit issues. So here we are on portal.azure.com, and by clicking the menu button and going to all services, I can do a search for the word VPN. All right, and then from there I can see an option here called Virtual Network Gateways. I'm just going to click that, and then I'm going to click to create a virtual network gateway. All right, so we'll just wait on that to pop up here. And then I'm just going to give it a name and call it My VPN Gateway. All right. Associate that with EastUS. I'm going to take the defaults here. SKU, just take the defaults on that. Default on generation. And as far as virtual network, I'm going to click to create a virtual network. All right. And from there, I could name this virtual network whatever I want to name it, right? So this VPN gateway, I'll call this, we'll call this the hub network. All right, because maybe this is where our VPN gateway is going to be. We'll create a resource group too. Okay, we'll just call this VNet demo. Click OK. And virtual network address space 10.0.0.0. I am going to change that to just 10.1.0.0/16. All right, and then we'll create a subnet. All right, and I'll just call this subnet 1A. All right, set the range to 10.1.0.0/24. That gives 251 addresses. It's really 254, but Azure reserves a few. So we'll click OK. All right, creating that. And then if I want to create a public IP address to go with it, yep, I'm going to call this my VPN GW pip for public IP address. Not going to really get into a lot of availability zone stuff here. Just leave that alone. And then, of course, with VPN gateways, if you want redundancy with all that, you can go with this option here. And if your company is linking this to your own network and it's going to be using border gateway protocol, you would enable that. Okay, which I'm not getting into all the details here. On that, we'll click to create. And once the validation is done, I'm going to go ahead and create. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and just pause the recording while that's getting created. All right, that's finally done. It does take sometimes about 30 minutes for a VPN gateway to get deployed. So just kind of a forewarning, if you create one on your side, you want to make sure you be a little bit patient with it because it does take time. All right, from there we're going to click Go to Resource, and we are now on our VPN gateway connected to it through Azure or Azure Service. And I want to talk a little bit about troubleshooting some issues. So the first thing we can do when it comes to troubleshooting issues with a VPN gateway is there's a blade called Diagnose and Solve Problems. Now, I will say that unlike some of the issues you run into, like in the Windows environment where you go to help and support and troubleshoot and it doesn't really do a whole lot for you, I will say that this is actually a pretty decent place where you can look up some of the common issues and try and troubleshoot those issues. For example, if we're talking about connectivity, there's an area here called connectivity. I can click troubleshoot, and then I can select, are we dealing with a site-to-site VPN connection issue or point-to-site? So site-to-site would be if you were connecting like your on-premise VPN gateway, VPN router that's on-premise to the cloud and establishing a connection from on-premise network to the cloud. This would be the one we would choose. If you were dealing with the scenario where you had a user who's trying to connect into the VPN. Maybe you got a user who's working from home and they're wanting to connect in to the VPN gateway that way. That would be point to site. Okay, so we would select whichever option we want. Okay, and then from there you can see that it's going to process through and try to detect any type of issues. It's checking now, and we're gonna get a little message back letting us know if there is any type of issue that's been detected. All right, one thing right here, you'll notice it says new configuration failed on instance. Applying new configuration or virtual gateway has failed, mainly because right now there's no connections to it at all. There's nothing that's been detected at all. But from there, you'll have these troubleshooters that you can run. So this is one thing I want you to remember about this. You've got troubleshooters that you can run through the Diagnose and Solve Problems area, okay, that could help you. You can also rerun diagnostics. So if you were getting an error, you could actually jump over and try to fix it, come back and rerun this diagnostic test and see if the error is still showing up. All right, so that's the first thing I wanted to point out for you. Let's go back to our VPN gateway. The next thing to look at is, do we have any connections right now? And as you can see, there are no connections. Right, we have not established any kind of connection with on-premise or any of that. All right, and so we would select this if we were actually establishing a connection. But from there, we're going to look down here at logs,
and you have a series of queries that you can run as well. All right, so if you have had issues, like for example, let's say you have a user who is trying to connect, you've already attempted to diagnose and solve the problem, you can run some queries here. For example, I could run a query for failed point-to-site connection, and it generates a query that could try to give you some more information on the problem. All right, so running queries is another option. You can also create alerts. So if I go back over here to alerts, you can see I can create an alert rule. All right, specify the type of alert rule maybe I'm looking into. So again, if this is going to involve one of these options here, or one of these signals here, maybe it's resource health. Maybe if it's BGP, again, that's Border Gateway Protocol. That would be if your company is using Border Gateway Protocol in regards to the VPN gateway connecting. You would look at that. Maybe it's a bandwidth problem. So maybe I want to look at bandwidth. I could select tunnel bandwidth. All right, and you can set thresholds that you want to be alert. You can create an alert rule, an action rule that's going to be performed. For example, it could send you a text message over your cell phone or email, all of that. So that's another option that we've got when dealing with our VPN gateway connection issues. And then finally, the last thing I want to show you here is metrics. So I can click on metrics, and I have a bunch of different metrics that I can be monitoring. You'll see those here. And of course, if you're like most people, of course, you jump in here and you're like, I don't really know what all this means. If you highlight over the top of it, they do give you a description of what the metric is. Okay, so you can go down through here and maybe, like, for example, tunnel bandwidth. I could see if I was, having a tremendous amount of bandwidth. Could be that, maybe the reason your VPN gateway is not working, you could be being denial of service attacked. You just don't know. Of course, there is what's called denial of service attack protection that can be added, which I'm not getting into in this video, but that is something you could do. So these various metrics are another great way for you to, monitor what's going on. There is also a reset button down here, okay? And this is also very helpful, because one mistake that a lot of people make when dealing with the VPN gateways, they go in and they configure a bunch of stuff, and then they maybe they're testing things or trying to fix something, and then they've gone so deep into configuring the thing that they don't know what they've changed, or they've forgotten what they changed. Now you can just reset. So very helpful way just to kind of take everything back to the defaults, as opposed to like having to delete the VPN gateway and re-add it, because you already know it can take about 30 minutes to do that. Okay. Another thing you can do if you're afraid of somebody messing with deleting it or something, you can go to locks, and you can place a lock on the VPN gateway. It can be a read-only lock, which means you can't change anything, or it can be a delete lock, which would prevent somebody from deleting the VPN gateway. This is if you're especially in a big environment, you have a bunch of admins doing various things. All right. Hopefully that gives you some of the fundamentals now when it comes to troubleshooting these connection issues with your VPN gateway. Now, one thing I do want to recommend, if you are creating a VPN gateway, like following along with me, I would not leave this VPN gateway connected in your Azure environment very long, because it does cost, I want to say it's like roughly 50 cents an hour or something. So you don't want to leave it running too long just for testing purposes. It's okay to create it and then get rid of it. All right. So I am going to, my VPN gateway will be left in my environment for a little while, but I'm going to get rid of it as well. And then if I'm playing around with VPN gateways a little later, I can always recreate them. All right. So I would just recommend deleting the VPN gateway if you're doing this as well, just to make sure it's not wasting your Azure credit. Hey, this is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed getting to experience a little bit of this course, and I hope you'll join me on the full adventure. If you'll check the description of this video, you'll see a link that'll show you how you can get access to the full course. Now, in the full course, you're going to learn how to set up a practice environment where you can practice hands-on, And I'm going to provide you with lots of virtual simulations that you can do 24/7. All you need is a web browser. So I hope you'll join me, and I hope you'll also give me a like and subscribe. I'm trying very, very hard to get this channel to build and grow, and so I hope you'll take the time to do that.